Hello and welcome back to a brand new video of Fox Flicks on Bandit Games. Today we'll see in his video of all bosses explained in Zelda Majora's Mask. Let's hop in and see what he can tell us about these bosses.
A Zelda game without bosses is like a box of chocolates that's empty. You never know what you're gonna get because there's nothing in there. To continue my series explaining every boss in every Zelda game, in this video we'll focus on the bosses and mini-bosses of the darkest game in the Zelda franchise, Majora's Mask. But I do have a pretty hefty disclaimer to get through before we begin. See, the nature of Majora's Mask is questionable to say the least, and by that I mean the notion of whether or not the entire land of Termina and its subsequent inhabitants is real is perhaps one of the most debated things in the entire Zelda fandom. Because of this, I'm gonna completely wimp out and refrain from coming up with my own theory about Termina in this video for several reasons, one of which being that would take way too long, and instead I'm going to default to the official explanation located within the Hyrule Encyclopedia, which is that Termina in and of itself was created complete with its own moon when the Skull Kid donned the Majora's Mask out of the Skull Kid's corrupted and twisted memories of Hyrule. Now I know the elite theorists and lore masters out there listening to this are automatically cringing and rolling your eyes, and it may be debatable, but just hold your horses. It'll all make sense because I will explain what I believe happened in addition to what the encyclopedia tells us. Plus, there are several very good reasons to believe that the books are canon. For more information on that, check out this fantastic video on that exact topic by my good buddy Monster Maze. And thinking of Termina this way does explain a lot of the extremely odd happenings and tools and people and bosses that pop up in Majora's Mask from Ocarina of Time, but anyway, that's enough of that. The last thing I'll say is, spoiler alert, obviously. The bosses in Majora's Mask can be pretty much all grouped into one of three umbrella categories. Bosses that were corrupted by the power of the four giant masks, bosses that are the four giant masks, and of course the big bad Majora itself.
Let's go.
So let's start with the first category of bosses that have their own reasons or were corrupted and work our way up the ladder. The first bosses you encounter in the game besides the Skull Kid / Majora's Mask themselves, which isn't really a boss fight, would be the two mini-bosses of the Woodfall Temple. The first of which is a Dynalphos. This is simply a monster that does appear multiple times in the game and across the franchise that's really more of a powerful species of monster than a notable boss. So really the explanation for it is the same as it would be for a Lizalfos or an Airalfos or even a Bokoblin. It serves the forces of darkness and somehow either found or created.
Oh, come on. We'll be right back in a moment. Okay, we're back.
Or created its own weapon and armor and wants nothing more than to make Link go to sleep in a permanent kind of way. The next mini-boss of the Woodfall Temple is yet another repeating enemy in the game, the Gecko, with two Ks. However, unlike the Dynalphos, the Gecko is actually not normally a bloodthirsty monster. It's actually a corrupted frog, which is otherwise harmless and kinda cute. When under the effects of corruption, the frog mutates into a more lizard-like form that walks on two legs and, you know, tries to kill Link. And both geckos in the game, this one and the one that appears later on in the Great Bay Temple, show signs of intelligence in that the first one runs away from Link and primarily attacks by riding on top of a killer turtle monster called a Snapper, and the second one encases itself in Mad Jelly, which acts like both a shield and a method of attacking Link. In either case, when defeated, the geckos don't die, but rather just devolve back to their original little frog body, so you don't have to feel too bad about it. As far as what dark power is responsible for corrupting them though, why, it would be none other than Majora itself, or more specifically the corresponding giant mask, but more on that later. The next natural boss encountered would be the Wizrobe, which is again a repeating mini-boss that pops up in the Snowhead Temple, and then again in the Castle of Icona, Stone Tower Temple, and the Secret Shrine. Most fans probably know that Wizrobes are not new enemies to the franchise. Far from it, actually, with their first appearance stemming from the first game, and stretching to being included in 12 of the games in total. In each appearance, Wizrobes are always an intelligent species of humanoid creatures that are very proficient in magic, but the curious thing about them is that they tend to switch up their appearance quite a bit, from being more human-looking in the original games to being birds, or maybe even the Rito in the Wind Waker, to being whatever the hell this is in Breath of the Wild. Kinda looks like Gru from Despicable Me. We're going to steal the moon! Regardless, the Wizrobes in Majora's Mask are definitely more human-looking, and of course are set out to make Link's life as hard as they can. They teleport around their rooms and cast magical attacks towards Link, and when defeated, burst into flames, leaving no corpse behind. As far as where they come from though, it's about as unclear as any of the other Wizrobes in the franchise. They appear to be of a race of humanoid creatures that learned magic and decided to serve the forces of darkness, which in this case would be Majora and its lackeys. I don't personally think they're completely human though, on account of their rather large stature and goblin-like appearance. Moving on, the next bosses are the Gerudo pirates from the Pirate Stronghold, which are really just Gerudo women, and this is one of those bosses in Majora's Mask that's only really explainable by way of Hyrule Encyclopedia's interpretation of Termina, which again is to say that Termina was created out of the Skull Kid's twisted memories of Hyrule. Clearly the Skull Kid either had heard of the Gerudo women of the desert or had seen them before, and I'm personally leaning towards the latter because Iron Knuckles and even the Witch Sisters Koame and Kotake, which are straight out of the deserts of Ocarina of Time, are also present in Majora's Mask, but they all operate and act completely differently, with no ties to their original lore. In this game, the Gerudo aren't desert dwellers, but are rather fearsome pirates. And without getting into too much of the narrative, they cross paths with Link when Link takes it upon himself to save the eggs of Lulu, who is the main singer of the super sick Zora rock group called the Indiegogo's. The Gerudo pirates, under the leadership of one particular pirate named Avail, stole Lulu's 7 baby eggs because the Skull Kid told them they were the key to entering the Great Bay Temple, which they wanted to enter in search of getting rich off of the treasure within. Pirates, am I right? Anyway, that's where the Gerudo swordswomen as mini-bosses come in. Link fights 3 of them in the game, each of which are guarding one of Lulu's eggs. Next up is one of 2 mini-bosses in the Great Bay Temple, a giant eyeball monster known as Wart. Wart also appears in the Secret Shrine, but there are reasons to believe that all the bosses in the Secret Shrine are actually duplicate bosses from the land of Termina, which would mean that in reality, there's only really one Wart. On the old Great Hyrule Encyclopedia that used to be an actual online resource hosted on the official Zelda.com, but has since been taken down for unknown reasons, Wart was said to have been a guardian of the Great Bay Temple at one point. It's unknown as to why Wart is no longer considered a guardian of the Great Bay Temple, but since it's a theme with the game as well as most Zelda games, I'll chalk it up to the corruption of the Great Bay Temple's corresponding giant mask. Next up is the fun stuff, the bosses of Icona. And by fun, I mean scary and depressing. To start, the entire land of Icona is that of a forgotten and barren...
Oh, come on. And we're back.
Wasteland that was once the mighty kingdom of Icona and became the location of countless wars and battles and bloodshed and just general unpleasantness. It's also currently experiencing a very particular plague, one that entails the countless dead soldiers and foreign assassins coming back to life. On the plus side, this makes explaining a large portion of its bosses easier, since said large portion of bosses in Icona Valley are the aforementioned undead. According to the undead king of Icona named Egos Du Icona, the undead are all awry and evil and restless because someone flung open the doors of the Stone Tower Temple, from which a dark wind blows. With all that being said, the first boss you face in Icona is the undead giant who served in Icona's army as its captain, known as Captain Kita, or Skull Kita, who upon being resurrected immediately challenges you to a race, because he's got the need for speed. The captain was actually defeated in battle, which brought him shame that carried with him into death, and is also the reason why he's dead. However, upon being defeated by Link, he passes his captain hat on to Link and asks you to give his final words that the war is over to his men, who still linger on as stall children in the mortal realm, serving their captain even in death. And after he tells Link this, he asks his captain if he may take his leave, and finally, he takes it. Following the undead trail all the way to the crumbling castle of Icona, Link will then meet the lackeys of the king, 2 unnamed Stalfos Skelly-Bros, and the king himself in the throne room. Upon defeating all of them and curing their undead bodies by burning them with light, Egos Du Icona explains that the kingdom of Icona is now fallen due to petty battles over ultimately meaningless conflicts, the kind of which was beginning to unfold as his lackeys began to bicker just moments before burning away into nothingness. He also explains that the dead began to rise because of the dark spell originating from the Stone Tower Temple, and after teaching Link the Elegy of Emptiness, which summons forth a soldier with no heart and is also the reason why the Ben Drowned creepypasta still haunts fans to this day, burns away himself, asking Link to shine the light of justice upon his kingdom with his dying breath. This light of justice comment also seems to imply that even before the plague of the undead was a scourge upon Icona, injustices had already fatally infected her heart. Now, there are a few other mini-bosses present in Icona, but they're legitimately hard to explain because technically speaking they shouldn't exist here, such as the Iron Knuckles and the Big Poe and the Poe sisters. Poes themselves exist as lingering spirits of the dead and are a staple of the Zelda franchise, and in a land soaked with blood and lined with countless bodies, lingering spirits seems to be a given. But it's the Iron Knuckles and Poe sisters specifically that must have come from the Skull Kid's memories, especially the latter, who are a group of 4 sisters that once resided inside of the Forest Temple of Ocarina of Time, which the Skull Kid lived right outside of. Especially given that in the child timeline, which is when this game takes place, Link would have never turned into an adult and killed the Poe sisters in the adult timeline, so logically they should still be located within their Forest Temple, and the same goes for the Iron Knuckles in the Spirit Temple. However, because we're working off of the assumption that Termina is a twisted version of Hyrule that is somewhat parallel to it, we are going to go with that explanation for the Iron Knuckles and Poe sisters and even Sharp and Flat present in Icona Valley. The final 2 bosses of this first category are the mini-bosses of the Stone Tower Temple itself, the first of which is the Garo Master, the strongest and master of the Garo, who are present all over the land of Icona. The Garo are also undead, just like most of the other monsters in Icona, and are actually spies that hail from a country that was at war with Icona when it was alive. According to Pamela's father, who's a super smart scientist professor dude, the Garo may even be hollow underneath their robes. And one of the reasons to believe this is that it is Garo law to destroy their own bodies upon death, leaving no corpse behind. Something they still do even in their undeath. The fact that the Garo Master is here within the temple, and the fact that the Garo Master knows the secret of flipping the temple is strange. Very strange, and actually leads me to believe that the Garo Master may have actually originated from the temple. See, Egos du Icona says pretty clearly that it's an impenetrable stronghold that hundreds of his soldiers could not topple. This implies that it's not his stronghold, not a creation of the Kingdom of Icona. And since it does require some jumping to infiltrate, which the Garo ninjas are all too proficient at, perhaps the Stone Tower actually was the home of the Garo. But that's just a tiny little mini theory to explain the Garo Master. The next and final not main boss of the game would be none other than the one, the only, the creepy, the vague Gomez. Now this scythe-wielding boss hovers above the ground, covers itself in bats, and has a rather crazed expression on its face. And of course is one of the most unexplained beings in the history of the Zelda franchise. So that's awesome. The aforementioned Zelda.com encyclopedia that's no longer visible online once said that Gomez was a powerful vampire, which kind of sort of explains all the bats, although whether or not the old official Zelda website definition is canon is debatable. Either way though, I think that Gomez is most likely a creation of whoever cursed the land of Icona by throwing the doors to the Stone Tower Temple open, and here's why. It's because thematically, everything about Gomez is dark. Gomez is surrounded by bats, which are nocturnal predators. Gomez itself is so dark that you can barely see any details of its body other than its eyes and gaping, smiling mouth. It also wields a giant reaper-like scythe, which is to represent death, and also goes hand...
Oh, come on, another one? And we're back.
Hand in hand with darkness and is the antithesis of light and life. And since Icona Kingdom is said to be enshrouded in darkness that stems from the Stone Tower Temple, it could be that Gomez himself is the incarnation of said darkness. In other words, Gomez is the curse that was placed upon Icona, the one that's making the dead come to life. But who made the curse, you ask? We'll get to that in a bit, but a cool little last detail I'll cover about Gomez is that his name in French is Le Faucheur, which means the Grim Reaper, and is also the French name of the Death Sword from Twilight Princess, both of which are bosses that wield giant bladed weapons and resemble the Grim Reaper. Perhaps their commonality is that they are both bringers of death, or rather, bringers of undeath. With all of the mini-bosses of the first category of the game out of the way, it's time to start focusing on the main bosses of the game, specifically the 4 giant masks that Majora created in order to capture the 4 giants of Termina, which are the 4 guardian deities of the land of Termina, which was once a land with only one country and no divisions or borders. Let's start off by briefly covering the story of the giants in case anybody doesn't know, or needs a refresher. The giants were not only the protectors of Termina, but were also the personal friends of the Skull Kid, perhaps even his only friends. Eventually though, the giants decided they wanted to sleep, I guess, and in doing so walked 100 steps north, south, east, and west, thus dividing the land into 4 quadrants and leaving the Skull Kid behind. This broke the Skull Kid's heart, and reportedly he then started to unleash his anger upon the people of Termina. And this is apparently long before the events of Majora's Mask. Eventually, the people called out to the giants to come to save them from this naughtiness, and they then told the Skull Kid to leave Termina or they will literally tear him apart. Yeesh, this broke the Skull Kid's heart even more, and then he returned, quote, to the heavens, where we can only assume he then met the 2 fairies in the Lost Woods and eventually stumbled across the Happy Mask Salesman, and then Link, and then the rest is history. Now, remember when I said at the start of this video that we're going with the encyclopedia's explanation of the creation of Termina? Well, we still are, but I also wanted to state that this history between the giants and the Skull Kid seemingly proves that Termina must have existed before the Skull Kid donned Majora's Mask, meaning Termina couldn't have been created by the mask, right? Well, yes and no. See, I think Termina already existed, and and that it's a different world that exists somewhere deep below the land of Hyrule, and it's accessible via a portal located inside an old tree in the Lost Woods. And no, I'm not going to expand on that because Termina isn't the point of this video. I also believe that the Skull Kid found this world one day and began going there back and forth out of curiosity, eventually befriending the four giants before eventually being banished from there. However, the Skull Kid returns to Termina after obtaining the Majora's Mask, only this time his mind has begun to become quite altered due to the corruption of Majora's power. Either this or Majora really did create Termina when the Skull Kid donned the mask, it's just that the Skull Kid donned the mask some time ago, which I suppose is possible, but unlikely since the Happy Mask Salesman appears here in the child timeline. Either way, at some point he gets an idea, and that idea is revenge on the giants in the land of Termina itself. Now, I'll get into the entirety of the revenge plan more in the final section covering Majora, but as far as the giants are concerned, basically the 4 giant masks were created by the Skull Kid / Majora in order to trap the giants inside of them, transforming their physical bodies into monsters of the Skull Kid's design. One became Odalwa, the giant masked jungle warrior. One became Got, the giant mechanical goat monster. Another became Gyorg, the giant fish monster. And the last became Twinmold, the giant masked insects. The monsters were, in my opinion, none other than the giants themselves, who took on these forms upon their imprisonment. Kind of like the imprisoned from Skyward Sword, which is Demise's transformation into a giant avocado, with squishy toes, although it's unknown as to what made them transform into what they did specifically. Since the 4 giant masks eventually returned to Majora's side though, I can only assume that the masks and subsequent monsters were designed and created by Majora itself. Once trapped within the masks, the giants then became the scourges of the lands they swore to protect, each cursing their own respective quadrants of Termina. The southern giant became Odalwa of the Woodfall Temple and cursed the swamp into becoming toxic. The northern giant became Goth of the Snowhead Temple and cursed the usually warm and balmy mountain into a fierce, unending blizzard. The western giant became Gyorg of the Great Bay Temple and plagued the waters with uneasy murkiness and caused the weather to become even hotter. And the eastern giant became Twinmold of the Stone Tower Temple and covered the land in darkness and undeath. Their corruption of the lands also led to the creation of several monsters and bosses that we already discussed, such as the geckos or Egos du Icona. But at the end of it all, after Link frees all of the giants from their evil mask shackles, we're left with one burning question. Why? Why did Majora specifically curse these giants into these specific monsters? It's finally time to talk about the ones that started it all, Majora and the Skull Kid. And here's another fair warning, buckle your seatbelts because this is about to get crazy. Most fans know by heart the story of the Skull Kid, a mischievous, childlike forest imp that donned an...
Most people do? Oh, come on. And we're back.
An evil mask and acted out in probably the worst temper tantrum the world has ever seen. But the character that really gets people going is that of Majora. Where did it come from? Is it an it or was it a person at one point? And why is it now sealed inside a mask? Let us begin with what we know. According to the Happy Mask Salesman, the Majora's Mask was created by an ancient tribe who used the mask for hexing rituals, which is another word for cursing or bewitching. So, you know, this ancient tribe was definitely not one of the good ones. However, that ancient tribe that used the mask for cursing others decided themselves that the mask was too powerful and could lead to too much catastrophe. So this hexing tribe sealed the mask away in the shadows. Interestingly, in the original Japanese version of the game, the Happy Mask Salesman says that the original tribe was destroyed, and that there was in fact a calamity brought about by Majura's mask, and that, quote, our ancestors sealed it away. Our ancestors, as in his and Link's shared ancestors, which would be the Hylians themselves. It doesn't necessarily prove much, but it is interesting to think about. An unknown amount of time passes, and eventually the Happy Mask Salesman gets his own hands on the mask, although we don't know how or when or even why he knew about the mask in the first place. Regardless, the Skull Kid eventually steals the mask from him and cue the events of the game. The Skull Kid then begins to undergo an evolution from harmless prankster to more serious prankster to then taking actual serious advances in his revenge plot, and decides to trap his old friends inside the giant masks, curse the land with numerous ailments, and finally bring the moon crashing into the face of the earth in order to destroy the world in defiance of the festival that celebrates the sun and the moon. Things so far are ultimately pretty easy to understand. Kid puts on mask, gets corrupted by mask, until the dark encounter with the Skull Kid atop the clock tower. See, once the Skull Kid's plot is stopped by way of the giants literally holding the moon in place, Majora's mask detaches from the Skull Kid and proves for the first time that it is sentient, and this is where stuff gets super interesting. It then proceeds to call the Skull Kid a puppet and enters the moon itself, empowering it even more and continuing continuing its downward descent to destroy the world. But
Yep.
wait, you might be thinking, I thought that was the Skull Kid's revenge plan. Why does
Nope.
Majora, who may have been created by ancient Hylians, want to destroy Termina? What does Termina
power
have to do with
hungry.
Majora's
What
mask?
else?
The only thing that ties Majora's
seriously,
mask
what else
to
could it
Termina
be?
and the Giants is the Skull Kid himself. So here's my theory, and of course you're welcome to believe whichever one you'd like. Now I have two theories, one of which is the literal theory of what's happening here within the lore of the universe, and the other of which is the theory of the symbolism behind all of this, and how it makes sense on a meta scale. But let's start with the lore theory. When Link enters the moon, personally, I feel like he enters the mind of Majora. I mean, a limitless grassy field with a tree in it being inside the moon is probably metaphysical. You know, probably.
Most
There are also
definitely. Yep. Well, hold on, folks. Gonna let it load. Be right back. And we're good to go.
children running around wearing the 4 giant masks, with one sitting alone wearing Majora's mask itself. But the reason why the mind of Majora is so lonely feeling and the child wearing Majora's mask sits by themselves with nobody to play with is because that is a reflection of exactly what happened to the Skull Kid. It's what was inside the Skull Kid's heart and memories. And because the Skull Kid felt it, Majora now feels it. That's why the 4 giant masked children are free to play amongst themselves while the Skull Kid / Majora child sits alone. It's a perfect picture of Termina's history told from the perspective of the Skull Kid. But this fictional reality also shares the memories of Majora. That's why the kids look like the Happy Mask salesman, and why they ask Link if he'll be a Happy Mask salesman too, since Majora remembers the Happy Mask salesman as the only individual in the past countless amount of years to pay attention to it. According to the old Miiverse website that again has since been taken down, the Happy Mask salesman himself says that he's never met these children before, and that he doesn't think they're normal kids, and that he's pretty sure there's some figment created by the Majora's mask. He even recognizes that they have the same hairstyle as him. So young, yet so stylish. But now we're left wondering, everything in this grassy field, all of the dialogue from these children, their appearances, the masks, it all stems from either the memories of the Skull Kid or the Majora's mask itself. But why? Well, I believe it's because of the fact that Majora's mask is now alive. But let me explain. See, the Majora's mask, when worn, gives the user the power to make their wishes a reality. Much like the Triforce, actually, but yet the opposite of it. See, the Triforce will grant the wish of its user, but will separate if its user is unbalanced, meaning the Triforce requires balance. Majora's mask, on the other hand, creates imbalance. It corrupts. It takes the deepest, darkest parts within your mind and brings them to the surface, eventually making those dark thoughts worsen and completely take control. Think about it like the Venom symbiote and Spider-Man, but if the Venom symbiote also granted the wishes of Spider-Man. Now give that symbiote to an angry, emotionally distraught human being who has not yet figured out how to control their emotions, like a child or a Skull Kid. That in and of itself is a scary notion, but I think that the true horror is actually even worse. See, there's a reason why Majora's mask initially wasn't alive, but it is now, and why it was so terrifying to the ancient tribe once they discovered its true nature. In my
Oh, come on. And we're back.
opinion, Majora's mask darkens the wearer's heart because it feeds off of it. It grows from it, and eventually it becomes alive because of it and forms a literal incarnation of the darkness of its wearer's heart. Their darkest desires, their deepest hurts, their inescapable loneliness, and the culmination of all of their wrath. And that is the heartbreaking, deep, dark horror of Majora's mask. It's why Majora pushed the dark thoughts and feelings within the Skull Kid to the surface. It's why Majora continued to enter the moon and pursue the same dark intentions given to it from the Skull Kid. It's why the moon area created by Majora is lonely and desolate, and it's why Majora itself is wild and childish and full of wrath like the Skull Kid, and begins forming a veiny, organic body based off of these very emotions in front of our eyes. And we know this is the entire darkness of Majora because after defeating it, the evil has officially escaped the mask, proven by the Happy Mask salesman. But one other aspect of the final fight that I don't have to explain, but I will anyway, because according to the Hyrule Historia is the canonical version of events, would be the Fierce Deity's mask that Link dons in order to transform into the Fierce Deity and kill Majora's mask once and for all. The Japanese term for it is Kishin, which is used to refer to gods that have a righteous fury against the enemies of humanity. And according to Aonuma himself, the Fierce Deity mask is supposed to be the culmination of all the memories of Termina's people. Their combined will, if you will. It seems to me that just like Majora's mask is the incarnation of...
Now, that's actually sound real quick. There's more lore to the Fierce Deity mask, saying that the Fierce Deity and the original Majora, according to the manga, were enemies in a land where time never passed. The Fierce Deity started to play a song, and the Majora of then and would dance for 3 days and 3 nights before collapsing of exhaustion and slowly dying. Afterwards, the false deity took its body and made Majora's Mask. That's the canon lore behind Majora's Mask and the false deity, according to the manga.
Of darkness of the Skull Kid's heart, the fierce deity is the incarnation of the righteous fury of humanity. Now, it's given to Link from inside the Majora Moon area from the child representing Majora itself, so that they can play good cop, bad cop before fighting, which is strange, but makes more sense when you look at the situation symbolically. And to explain the symbolism, let's start again with Majora's Mask. The deadly, heart-shaped ancient hexing mask is a picture of what happens if the dark and harmful will towards others inside our hearts is left unchecked, specifically with a focus on how angry and wrathful we can be in our childhood when our emotions have yet to mature. And the masks that Link gives to the Moon Children that run around wanting nothing but to play games represents the different pieces of our childhoods, our imaginations, the games we would play. And when you give the final piece of your immaturity away, you receive the more grim and serious maturity of adulthood in return, which has the power to destroy even the darkest of childhood intentions or hurts. Because, after all, isn't the Skull Kid's wrath warranted? Wasn't he hurt by the giants, his closest friends? The problem is he went too far and wasn't mature enough to deal with it. So simply put, Majora's Mask, to me, among many things, is an allegory for growing up and overcoming and defeating the traumas of our childhood, the darkness we so often bring with us. But that's just my thoughts on the matter. Speaking of my thoughts though, this turned out to be the longest and most thought-intensive boss lore video yet, or at least it felt that way when I was researching it. If you enjoyed it or my efforts into making it, please consider leaving a like on the video and subscribe if you haven't already for much more to come. Seriously, you can always unsubscribe if you change your mind, so give it a shot. If you learned something new, or if I missed something, let me know in the comments below, and also let me know which game you'd like me to cover next. Honestly, I'm probably going to start up the series for the Metroid franchise pretty soon, so you're going to want to stick around for that. Huge thanks as always to my bandit crew, of which I have a few new names to announce. Say hello to Gemma F, Zach P, and Meme Supreme, all of which who joined up recently. Thank you guys so much. You guys are the reason why this channel is possible, and if you watching are interested in joining up,
looks like he's almost there to give the thanks, so I'll go ahead and give mine. Thank you all for joining me in today's video. I want you all to remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Down in the description will be a link to the original video, so remember to support the original creator and all they do, and I'll see all you folks next time for when we flick on. Peace out.